November 4th, 1988. Three friends decide to go hunting on Baranof Island. This island is one of a few in the Alaskan Alexander Archipelago that borders Canada. It is a wildlife haven. Humpback whales, dolphins, otters, and porpoises frequent the icy waters. Its northern tip is used by a breeding colony of Steller sea lions. The island is also home to mountain goats, Sitka black-tailed deer, and grizzly bears. Harley Sievenpiper, David Trago, and James Hendricks arrived at the southeastern corner of Baranof Island at Port Alexander for their hunting adventure. They carried with them camping gear, rifles, and ammunition. Their target was the Sitka deer. They were experienced hunters and decided to spread out to cover more ground and find their prey. From Port Alexander, they trekked from the shoreline up into the forest. The beauty of the scenery was stunning. The skies were overcast and gray. A damp drizzle filled the air. While Harley remained closer to the shoreline, the others headed deeper into the forest. As Harley cut up further away from the beach, he came across the perfect hunting ground. The trees opened out into a wide plateau of muskeg or peat bog. It was an ideal place to spot deer that came wandering into the clearing from the forest. Quietly, he set down his backpack and raised his rifle, scoping the open expanse. Following the tree line around the bog, he saw nothing. All was quiet, all was still. Only the occasional bird was heard. Harley lay down on the damp ground, keeping his eyes on the forest clearing. Patiently, he waited. Lying there, he lifted his deer collar to his mouth and blew. It mimicked the sound of a distressed fawn. Harley paused and held his breath. He could hear nothing. He blew the collar once more. He pricked his ears and scanned the tree line. The thrill of the wait was building. Any minute now, a deer could emerge into view. Any minute now, he could have his shot. As he lay there calling, listening, anticipating, he suddenly heard something. He looked to his left to see an enormous brown bear charging at him. There was no warning. There was no time to react. This wasn't a mock charge. The bear was onto him. Harley managed to let out a loud cry as the bear smashed into him, sending his rifle flying into the muskeg. The bear sunk its teeth into Harley's neck. It dug its claws into his shoulders, pinning him to the ground. Harley could hardly breathe. The sheer weight from the bear crushed his bones. The bear's jowls were dripping. Its breath was warm and wet, only inches from his own face. Harley let out an ear-piercing scream as the bear tore flesh from bone. The 700-pound grizzly bear attacked Harley so ferociously that his attempts to fight back were in vain. With the wind knocked from his lungs, the heavy weight of the animal pinning him into the cold, wet peatland, and such vicious bites and slashes, Harley only managed to scream out again and again, a blood-curdling scream that his two friends heard echoing through the forest. Harley was dead within minutes. Hearing their friends' distressed cries, David and James came running. They jumped over logs and dived under branches, calling out Harley's name. They ran as fast as they could, clutching their rifles and tearing through the undergrowth. When they got to the forest clearing, they could see nothing. They could hear nothing, not a cry or a scream, not a growl or a grunt. All was quiet once more, as if nothing had happened. They called out again. Searching around, they found Harley's backpack, right where he had left it. Then they saw it, a sight that shook them to the core. They saw a large pool of fresh blood on the ground. The shrubs had been flattened. They could see the struggle that had ensued. The earth had been torn up and thrown around. The trail of blood led off into the undergrowth. The two men ran as fast as they could to go and find help. They knew that Harley must be dead. They knew that he must have been taken by a bear, and they knew that the same bear was still out there. Sprinting through the rugged terrain, they made it back to Port Alexander. With its prey subdued, the bear had dragged Harley's body for half a mile parallel to the beach, looking for thicker cover to feed at its leisure. The bear then dragged Harley for another mile deeper into the woods. With night closing in, a search and rescue operation wasn't initiated until the following day. Harley's distraught friends sat up all night, waiting and wondering. The thought of their friend being taken so savagely and so suddenly haunted them. The thought that his body was still out there was a chilling one. Fish and Wildlife Trooper Roland Young and Don Clutting, a member of the Sitka Volunteer Fire Department Search and Rescue Squad, headed up the search the next day. They flew down from Sitka to Port Alexander to commence their search. They were joined by a dozen residents of Port Alexander, all eager to help and locate the missing 40-year-old man. David and James led them to the spot where the attack happened. The search and rescue team were able to follow the trail left as the bear dragged Harley away. There was so much blood at the initial site that Roland Young was quite sure that Harley had been killed then and there before being dragged off. The trail was relatively easy to follow. The trodden undergrowth was marked with blood, and as the search team stepped deeper into the woodland, their nerves were on a knife edge. They knew they were getting closer to the bear. They began to find torn pieces of clothing and items belonging to Harley scattered along the trail they were following. His glasses were found on the ground amongst the leaves. His rifle lay submerged in the peat bog. Contents of his pockets strewn to one side. With every rustle in the trees and every chirp from a bird, the team jumped. Their hearts were racing. There was a predator within yards of them, and they were the prey. 3 of the men decided to wait on a nearby ledge, keeping an eye out for an approaching bear. Everyone had their rifles locked, loaded, and raised and ready. The others continued along the trail of blood and torn clothing. Creeping forwards, placing each foot carefully in front of the other, they suddenly heard a menacing growl. Their hearts leapt into their chests, pounding in their rib cages. Peering through the thick tree cover, they could just see the head of a grizzly standing over its kill. It was staring right at the 3 men on the ledge and went charging towards them. The others who had approached it from amongst the trees felt the bear rush past them. Its feet thundered on the damp ground. Its tremendous speed and power forced bushes and branches to the earth. They aimed their guns and shot the bear. The first shots hit the bear directly in the ribs, but the great animal didn't even flinch. It continued to bound towards the 3 horrified men. With nowhere to go, they were trapped. Another 2 shots fired. This time, it struck the bear near the shoulder, and it fell to the ground, just 3 feet from the search team. They fired once more into the animal's skull. The search and rescue team were shaken by the close call. The bear had nearly charged them down. The fearlessness and aggression displayed by this mighty and powerful grizzly had unnerved the team. Then came the devastating and harrowing job of moving Harley's remains from where they lay. He had been mostly devoured by the bear. It seems it had been a predatory attack rather than one of territorial dominance. Mock charges are common when territory has been encroached upon. If a bear does follow through with an attack, it often walks away after the initial attack if it considers you are no longer a threat. In the case of Harley, this had been the first fatal bear encounter in southeast Alaska for more than a decade. On average, deadly bear attacks occur once every 3 or 4 years in Alaska. Between 2000 and 2017, there were 66 bear attacks in Alaska. Sadly, 10 of these proved fatal. But everyone knows that when you enter bear country, you do so at your own risk. This time, the hunter became the hunted, and sadly, met his terrifying final affliction. The tiger weighs over 500 pounds and can grow to be 3 meters or 10 feet long from nose to tail. With sharp canine teeth over 3 inches long, it can tear apart entire limbs in a single bite. The Siberian tiger is known to possess a particularly vengeful and begrudging attitude towards anyone that dares cross its path, man or beast. With a cunning mind to match, it can remember encounters for weeks and plan elaborate plots to follow and hunt its prey. Once a near-extinct species, the predator also known as the Amur tiger had come back to life through conservation efforts and repopulated the province of Primoria, near the world's largest undammed river, the Amur River. For decades, the tiger sat comfortably at the top of the food chain, feeding on moose, elk, and wild boar. That was until humans started populating the region, trying to scrape out a living in the dense taiga forests after the fall of the Soviet Union. Poachers realized the potential of this area, despite the fact that they had to settle among some of the most dangerous predators in the world. The meat of the Siberian tiger and the wild boar fetched good money in the black markets near the Chinese border. And for many like Markov, this was their only sustenance in the broken post-Soviet economy. On a cold winter morning in 1997, Markov loaded his supplies, kissed his wife goodbye, and set out with his friend on a 50-mile drive deep in the heart of the frozen taiga forest. The plan was to spend the night in a remote cabin and leave to hunt in the morning. As the sun dawned, he set out on foot, accompanied by his attack dogs, who could also be used to sniff out the scent of the Siberian tigers from their footprints. In below freezing temperatures, the snow covered the solid ground by at least 10 inches as Markov limped his way through the layers of snow among the forest trees and thick brush. Markov spotted a trail of footprints that were even bigger than his hand. Prints as large as this could only belong to the great Siberian tiger. He followed the tracks for miles, hoping they would lead him to the animal they belonged to. Armed with a shotgun, Markov was confident that he was one clear shot away from a kill that could make him good money in this failing economy. Then, as he peered over one of the trees, he saw the enormous Siberian tiger feeding on a wild boar. It looked over at the man, locking eyes for a few seconds before going back to eating, refusing to let go of its kill. The fierce animal looked unfazed as its muscles rippled with every bite of flesh it pulled from the dead boar. Markov realized he was close enough to get the clear shot he needed. He raised his shotgun and fired a bullet straight into its torso. It was a sure hit, he thought. It was only a matter of time that the tiger would succumb to the fatal injury. He walked ahead, salvaged whatever meat he could from the carcass of the dead wild boar, and followed the tiger a few more miles as it limped away injured in the deep snow. The white snow made it easy to follow the blood trail, but he noticed it decreasing the farther he went along in its pursuit. It wasn't long afterwards that the trail stopped, and Markov was left standing alone in the snow with no idea of where the tiger was, dead or alive. He quickly realized that the tiger must not have been fatally wounded and decided to head back to his camp to return the next day. He stored one piece of the boar meat just outside of his camp and left for town to see what he could trade for the other one. But while Markov was away, the wounded tiger had followed the scent of the man to the cabin and smelled its boar hunt stored outside in the wellhead. In frustration, the tiger reclaimed his kill and destroyed the wellhead in the process. It then camped outside near the cabin, awaiting the man's return. When Markov got back to the cabin, he noticed his dogs barking loudly and incessantly, trying to signal to him that something wasn't right. He peered through the window and saw the tiger at a distance. He called his dogs back into the cabin. If the injured tiger had still not left after reclaiming its boar meat, he was after more than just the boar meat. Markov realized that the animal had come for vengeance, and he could not afford to let it live once it had smelled his scent. He set up his gun through a shooting port in the wall and opened fire, wounding the tiger twice now from the same gun. It disappeared into the forest, still able to carry itself despite being shot several times. Markov decided to go to his friend Duncha's cabin not far away and drive away to safety with him in his car. His friend urged him to stay the night at his place because the car's radiator fluid had to be drained every night to keep it running, and they couldn't leave right away. Markov was now visibly frustrated and decided to make his way back to his cabin and deal with the problem the only way a poacher knows, by shooting the tiger until it's dead. Little did he know, in his absence, the tiger had torn down his cabin's front door and had made its way inside, chewing and clawing at anything that had Markov's scent on it. It shred to pieces clothing, mattresses, and tools that he had used, and then found a well-hidden spot outside the trail to lie in wait for Markov's return. It was dark, and Markov was just making his way to the entrance of the cabin when he was ambushed by the tiger. Caught unarmed, he soon found himself at the mercy of the vengeful Siberian tiger, and after their last two encounters, there wasn't much mercy left. Several hours later, investigators discovered a chilling scene outside of the camp, one that captured the grueling nature of the attack and the terrified helplessness of Markov in his final moments before being devoured. The snow around the scene had melted and flattened from the wrestling and wriggling that Markov must have tried while being eaten alive. There wasn't much to call Markov's body anyway. A few bones here, a pool of blood, red snow there. Some of his clothes were found several feet away. His shoes still carried his severed feet. His sleeves still held his detached arms. The tiger was momentarily pacified after tearing apart its hunter and headed downstream. Word had now gotten out of the man-eating Siberian tiger, and terrified poachers and settlers evacuated the taiga forests to escape the same fate as Markov. The only one still in the area was 25-year-old Andrei Pachutnya. He was a trapper who had set up traps in the forest to catch animals for their fur. Andrei's parents urged him not to leave the house to check his traps until the tiger had been found, but he did not heed any advice to stay inside and set out in the forest. In Andrei's absence, the tiger had found his cabin and thrashed it just like it did to Markov's cabin. The Siberian tiger seemed to want to follow and tear to pieces anything that smelled remotely human. Upon his return, he was ambushed by the tiger near a neighbor's cabin, nestled behind a mattress as if it had been lying in wait for him all along. There was not much fight or resistance. Andrei attempted to pull his shotgun from his shoulder and take aim, but the bullet refused to fire. In the harsh Russian winters, older guns were known to have ammunition failures from a frozen cartridge. His shotgun failed at the last moment he would have wanted it to. Andrei was now easy pickings for the Siberian tiger, as it jumped on top of him, leaving him little chance for a fight. Young Andrei's father called for a search and rescue mission to find his son, and they did. But all that was now left of Andrei was a few bloodied clothes and a chard of the cross. The tiger had been feeding on him for over 3 days when the search team discovered him, and there was little of Andrew they could salvage from the site to return to his father. At the time, Project Tiger was a Western-funded animal conservation group operating in the taiga forest, trying to stop illegal hunters and poachers from driving the Siberian tiger to the brink of extinction. The head tracker for the mission, Yuri Trush, found himself in an ironic predicament. As a tiger conservationist and a researcher himself, he was tasked by the authorities to find the injured tiger and kill it on the spot. He was accompanied by officers Shibnev and Pionka, and the trio soon discovered the tracks of a limping tiger. It had been walking on 3 legs, carrying one in the air, likely wounded. The tracks led them to a remote area near the cabin of a man named Shlemenko. The party now knew the tiger was nearby. They listened closely to every ruffle in the trees and then saw the slightest movement in their field of vision. As they went close to the cabin entrance, the giant Siberian tiger leapt at Officer Trush from behind with a deafening, loud roar. All 3 men frantically tried to aim their guns at the tiger, but it was too late for the head tracker, as he quickly found himself beneath the angry behemoth tiger, clawing and gnawing at his vulnerable body. In the heat of the moment, the trio had fired dozens of bullets, and 11 of those hit the tiger, which after a few seconds finally collapsed and died. Gathering his senses, Officer Trush tried to figure out where his rifle had gone, only to later realize it had partially gone down the tiger's throat as it jumped at him. The Siberian tiger was loaded onto a truck and taken to the village to confirm that it was indeed the correct tiger. The tiger, after killing, maiming, and terrorizing settlers for far too long, had now finally been killed. The animal was later skinned and put up for display in the region's administrative headquarters as a stark reminder of the horror brought by the man-eating tiger, and a lesson for what happens when man and beast cross each other's paths, and in this situation, leading to 2 people's terrifying final affliction. Brady Penn was an experienced senior airman in the U.S. Air Force in 2021 when he suddenly received a call from his father, Steve. This was not uncommon, as he spoke to his father regularly, and so he picked up the phone. He could tell his father was excited as he quickly explained that he had won a hunting lottery, meaning that he had been awarded a permit to hunt for elk on Affliction Island. The island is famous for having some of the best hunting and fishing opportunities in North America and attracted lots of visitors during their holidays. It has an impressive diversity of wildlife, including the largest elk in North America, the Roosevelt elk. This animal is a prized catch among hunters and is something to really boast about catching. It's also impossible without a permit. The permit meant that only certain people were able to hunt in the area to avoid the destruction of the fragile ecosystems. You are able to enter the lottery for specific animals that you are allowed to hunt, and today, Steve had finally been selected and he wanted his son to go with him for a week-long trip. Brady immediately agreed, as he knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and wanted to spend time with his dad. For the next few months, the pair prepared for their adventure, as they knew that they would have to use their survival skills if they wanted to stay on the windswept island of Affliction. The island was well known for its unpredictable weather and strong winds, so they had to make sure they knew exactly what they were getting themselves into. They tested their equipment over and over to make sure they were prepared, undertook intensive hikes nearby, improved their shooting abilities, and made sure they had a plan for anything that may go wrong. Brady had been trained by the military, and Steve had lived in Alaska for over 30 years. They both knew what it took to survive. After months of training, they were ready for a trip of a lifetime. On the morning of October 12, 2021, the father and son duo were ready and waiting for their trip. They were stood on the dock waiting for their plane to take them to the island where they would be left all alone for a week. The wind was already increasing in strength, and the morning fog was thickening with every moment that they waited. The seaplane floated slowly towards them, giving the men one last chance to turn back and cancel their trip. With the increasingly bad weather, it was becoming apparent that if any issues arose during their time away, it would be almost impossible for an emergency rescue to save them. They decided that they would be able to deal with any problem that came their way and boarded the plane to take them to Affliction Island. It was a very small plane, and despite being battered with turbulence for the duration of the 45-minute flight, they managed to arrive on the island in relative safety. The beach was empty, and the reality of their solitude was quickly hitting the pair. The pilot prepared to leave before turning to the men for some final advice. "That hill right there is going to be your best bet for a campsite," he said. "I'll see you in a week unless we hear from you sooner. I can't say I envy you out here in this weather." With that, he got back into the seaplane and flew away, leaving the father and son duo truly stranded. They hurriedly began setting up their tent to protect themselves from the night that would quickly be setting in. They managed to erect it just in time as more wind and freezing rain began to unleash onto them. They eventually slept, knowing that the next few days would really put their survival skills to the test. The next morning rolled around and the weather had not improved. The men knew they couldn't wait for too long, so begrudgingly packed up their belongings and began the difficult hike through thorns and thick bracken, and Brady could feel any exposed skin being ripped and torn by the passing branches. After receiving a beating from the elements, they made it to a ridge and found a game trail towards the valley beneath them. They followed the trail together, hopeful that they would be able to find some elk soon. Suddenly, Brady spotted a herd in the distance, and they began to stalk their prey, but lost them as suddenly as they had discovered them due to the tough terrain. They began to feel disheartened, but continued their trek in the hopes that a miracle might happen. And just like that, they abruptly found themselves face to face with a massive male elk. Instinctively, Brady fired his gun in the direction of the animal, knowing that he had only a split second to react before the elk would smell or hear him and bolt for cover again. The 1,200-pound animal crumpled to the floor, and just like that, they had accomplished their week-long goal in just 60 minutes. The duo were elated and happily began to cut up the elk so that they could take it back to their camp with them, and eventually take some of it back home. They knew that they wouldn't be able to take most of it back, but they could certainly try. They brought some back to the camp, but left the rest in a bright white game bag that they decided to hang in a tree so that nothing could get into it. The next day they returned, but quickly realized they couldn't see their bag in the tree anymore. They assumed it was the wind that had knocked it down, and so continued towards the area to check it out, cocking their guns just in case. They walked through the long grass, feeling at peace among the singing birds and long grasses. Even if their bag and game were gone, they were still able to appreciate that they were in a breathtaking place and were thankful that they were able to come on this trip together. Suddenly, the meadow fell silent, no birds at all. All they could hear was a low growling, and that's when they knew that they were in big trouble. Just 30 feet away, a huge Kodiak bear was charging right towards them, running through the trees as if they weren't even there, its eyes fixed on Brady and Steve. Before Brady could even blink, let alone draw his weapon, the bear was upon him. He was swatted to the side by a massive paw, pain shooting through his back as the bear put its entire body weight onto his spine. He was trapped, his rifle pushed beneath him, and with the extra weight on top of him, he had no way of moving. While he was thinking of what to do and how he could possibly survive this, the weight was removed from Brady's back. His father was pulling the bear off of him, giving him a final chance to save them both. The bear was immediately able to push Steve off of it, and after throwing him to the ground, was now also on top of him. But Brady was freed from the bear's weight and was holding his rifle. Despite the pain in his body, he struggled to his feet and fired his gun without a second thought, without even looking. The shot ripped through the bear's back hip, and with a ferocious roar of pain, the animal ran back into the trees. The pair quickly assessed each other for injuries, never taking their attention from the trees in case the animal came back. Steve had a few puncture wounds in his hands from the bear's teeth as he had been defending his son, but he had been wearing strong gloves and they were able to take the majority of the damage. Brady's trousers had been ripped and there were claw marks down his legs, but he was mostly unharmed. They were thankful that nothing worse had happened. They made their way back to their camp slowly and carefully, keeping a special eye out for the murderous bear. Luckily, they were able to make it back, and while they couldn't sleep as they listened out for any noises outside, they felt relatively safe within their camp. Luckily, this is the end of their story. The father and son were picked up by the plane the next day and were able to escape. Their teamwork, preparedness, and military training had saved them, proving once again that research and a little bit of luck will always provide you with some safety in the end, allowing them both to narrowly avoid becoming a food source for the bear and meeting their final affliction. On the morning of May 23, 2003, two cousins, Tok and Nat, set out to the Arctic Circle at the northern end of Canada looking for seals to hunt. They were a member of the First Nations tribe and natives of the area of Kodiak. With some of the harshest winters of any place on Earth, the geography of this region is inaccessible to travelers or hunters from the south for most of the year. Only in the spring does the heat warm the ice sheets enough to let the seals surface, giving hunters ample opportunity to lie in wait and kill them. The Aborigines had come to appreciate the utility of modern technology and had adopted many of the modern hunting and transportation tools that helped them hunt a lot more efficiently than otherwise. They had snowmobiles and rifles on this trip and possessed elaborate maps to make sure they were never lost. Their embrace of modern technology was somewhat eroding the natural appeal of their indigenous culture, but was also materially uplifting the lives of hundreds of people in the tribe. The wildlife of this frozen wilderness comprised of animals typical of the harsh, cold climate of the Arctic Circle, with wolves, fox, seals, moose, and the infamous polar bear populating the vast land. Polar bears are the apex predator of this food chain. Weighing more than 800 pounds and being over 3 meters long from head to tail, the bears are known to devour seals, walruses, and even washed-up whales. These formidable predators can even prey on humans if desperation forces them, as evidenced by the hundreds of recorded attacks over the past decades. But recently, some polar bears have ventured further down south due to the effects of climate change, looking for seals and small fish in the water on the northern Canadian coasts. The relatively warmer climate meant an abundance of prey even in the winters. On this fateful day, at around 9 a.m., Tok and Nat loaded supplies on their snowmobiles and headed 47 miles up north, where the seals were likely to have surfaced. Even in the warm summer, seals rarely stray far from the coasts, forcing hunters to journey to the prime hunting ground to the edge several miles away. At the end of an hour-long journey in the freezing cold breeze, the duo finally arrived at the edge of the land where the vast expanse of the sea opened up. Tok had been exhausted by the trip, and the cold wind at such high speeds froze their limbs numb. They needed time to recuperate and warm up as they looked out into the distance, standing at the edge of the continent. Their snowmobiles parked several feet away were the only thing that could take them home safely, and they were acutely aware of the predators that walked this frozen wasteland. It was early spring and most of the water was still frozen, with occasional openings and holes where seals would resurface from beneath in order to rest or feed. The two men realized that hunting seals would take more patience than they thought, as most were still underwater and the afternoon sun had not yet softened the ice sheets on the water enough to puncture. They looked around for a place to lay low and out of sight for the seals. Tok found a slight slope on the ground towards the edge just enough to hide the width of his body and laid down in aim with his gun loaded. Nat realized that they could ensure greater catch if they split up, and decided to walk several hundred feet away on the left to lay down in the same fashion. Several hours passed in contemplation for seals surfacing, but none was yet able to make a confident shot. But as Tok laid low on the icy shore, he heard something very different than a seal. There was no one around but him, and the subtle grunt seemed to be coming from behind him rather than the front. Frozen in place in his tight clothes, he managed to turn his head back, anticipating a moose or fox, but what he saw sent shivers of terror down his spine. Camouflaged among the white, snowy background stood a giant polar bear just a few feet away. It didn't look threatening at first, darting its eyes around and not looking straight at him as if uninterested in an attack. But Tok's heart was beating out of his chest, and it was difficult to stay calm or play dead. He locked eyes with the predator once, and that's when the bear made its first steps towards him. Tok turned his head back and curled into a fetal position in an attempt to hide. There was nowhere to run in the vast open expanse, and he knew jumping into the water would also be his last mistake. With his head on the ground, he felt the touch of the bear's nose on the back of his neck, sniffing and breathing, trying to decipher him. But just as swiftly, the bear took steps back and started walking to his left. Tok lay there and peeked from between his arms where the bear was going. It was several feet away now, and he saw the chance to get up and walk to his snowmobile. He rolled away silently and got close enough to board the vehicle and ride away to a safe distance, but he soon realized that the direction the bear had gone was also where his cousin Nat had positioned himself, completely oblivious to the massive danger approaching him. Between Nat and Tok was the giant polar bear, and there was no way to warn him. Tok was too rattled from the harrowing encounter to follow the bear or run past it to warn his cousin as it chased Nat's footprints in the snow. Caught between trying to save himself or save his cousin, Tok made the frantic decision of going back to find help. This one decision proved fatal for Nat, as he was caught vulnerable and unknowing of the predator chasing after him. A few minutes into the journey, Tok realized he didn't have the heart to leave Nat behind and turned his snowmobile back. But when he arrived at the scene, he quickly realized that it was too late. In the distance, Tok spotted a blood-reddened spot on the white snow with the bear chewing on the remains of his cousin. He let out muffled screams of terror and regret, watching helplessly the bloodied carcass of his cousin who had been deserted at the moment he needed him the most. The bear had torn him apart with two of his limbs lying separate from his torso. The bear had delivered a crushing stomp on the man's neck while he laid completely oblivious, hidden in the white snow. It broke Nat's spine and left him paralyzed and completely vulnerable. From then on, he was easy picking for the bear as it tore into his flesh and ate him alive, biting out chunks with its razor-sharp teeth. There were also deep bite marks on Nat's neck from the bear's 3-inch-long front canine teeth that had pierced deep into the flesh. Tok realized he was too late, and there was nothing he could do now but escape and call for help. His family and town were made aware of the tragic demise of their family member, and state authorities were alerted to bring back the remains of the young man. Seal hunting trips were put on hold for the duration of the year, and search teams were dispatched to locate the polar bear in order to avoid further attacks. Nat's family and friends were left devastated at the loss of their son, and Tok could hardly recover from the immense regret of not doing enough to save him. Researchers concluded that the bear encounters in the area were becoming increasingly commonplace owing to the plentiful fish and seals that northern parts of Canada hosted. Polar bears had started going long stretches of time without prey in the frozen Arctic and were being forced to descend in search for flowing water where they could find small fish and seals. The rising attacks have also been attributed to the expansion of human activity and settlements, as well as conflict over catching prey like fish and seals in the flowing water rarely found throughout the year. But Nat's death was a particularly gruesome reminder of why humans and polar bears should never have to cross paths. For poor Nat, his final moments were in a state of absolute terror and helplessness, being unable to move and eaten alive from the inside by the razor-sharp teeth of a vicious predator of the icy world, slowly succumbing to his final affliction.
With its rich agricultural history, the city of Chateau in Montana evokes striking images of a green landscape with a variety of wildlife. It is home to some of the world's most elegant species in the animal kingdom. Mule deers, wolves, badgers, squirrels, moose, elks, and bears, both black and grizzly, all coexist in this biota. This automatically makes Choteau a great venery ground for game hunting, and so it is no surprise that on October 3rd, 2015, 26-year-old Chase Delwo and his brother, 30-year-old Shane, decided to head west to Bynum to bow hunt elk. Having been brought up on a family ranch in Blackleaf, the two brothers were experienced big game hunters who used bows as their preferred weapon. It was a chilled Saturday morning, and the clocks were striking 8. Being October, Choteau was immersed in intense cloud cover with temperatures going as low as 7. The vile wind was full of snow, with each exhalation leaving a condensed cloud of air. This limited their vision to as far as only 5 meters of their surroundings. But the thought of hot, sumptuous elk steak that the brothers would eat to the marrow of the last bone was enough motivation for them to face the harsh weather. Their limited visibility meant that hunting by stealth was going to be a huge challenge, and so the pair hatched a plan. They geared up and decided to split. Shane, the older brother, was going to scale up a ridge and wait while Chase was to drive the elk herd towards a creek bed. The ridge Shane had climbed provided a clear aerial view of the creek bed where he would size one of the elks before taking it down. They had devised the perfect plan, free of any flaws, or so they thought. As Chase was meandering the creek bed, the heavens suddenly opened and the rain started pouring. Just like a musical chime, it began as tapping as a drop hit his shoulders, but it soon developed to a rattling pitter-patter with more drops pouring. With the snow, misty air, and now rain, the weather was worsening with every step he took. He wondered if it would be a successful hunt given the shortcomings. Suddenly, a loud bugle, followed by a chuckle at the end, cut him short on his thoughts. He knew that sound, having gotten used to it during his many hunting escapades. It was a bull elk. Judging by the origin of the sound, the elk was nearby. Vainly, his fiend mind struggled to comprehend the direction of the source of the bugle. The creek was covered with rich, soft grass that was beginning to get buried beneath the falling snow. To the north and east of him was the wonderful panorama of the rocky ridges and mountains partially covered in snow. And on one of those ridges was his brother patiently waiting to strike. Armed with his bow, Chase focused all his senses on finding the elk. Nothing in the world was going to stop him from completing this mission, not even the droning music of running water from the nearby streams that were about to freeze because of the cold. But before he could go further, an eerie feeling that he was being watched stopped him in his tracks. Motionless, Chase sniffed the wind. The air here changed. It smelt different. A scent had come to his nostrils, one he had not smelt in a long time. It stirred him strangely. If only he had been able to see distinctly for just 1 mile, his eyes would have discovered it. He reared up 3 steps behind, as if trying to slowly rest his haunches and sit like a trained dog with his bow raised to level his face, ready to release the arrow. But before he could, the bear leaped, attacking him as if it had been waiting for this moment all its life. This sent him to the ground with a thud. The grizzly bear was huge. On its hind legs, it was taller than any human with its feet planted firmly on the wet, muddy ground. With its shaggy, thick brown fur, it seemed to bear the mysteries of nature with it. The bear then opened its huge mouth, grumbled, and then sank its 3-inch fangs into Chase's left eye and skull, completely catching him by surprise. As it is with nature, the hunter sometimes becomes the hunted. Having grown up on a family ranch, bear encounters were not alien to him, as he had been charged by lone bears not once or twice. However, even with this rich, expansive background, he had been unable to avoid this nose-to-nose encounter with a grizzly bear. If only the weather was a bit more welcoming, Chase would have seen the bear from afar and avoided it. For a moment, the bear stopped attacking. Chase was silent and immobile. Bleeding and seriously injured, he felt helpless. He knew that death was within and knocking. But the ordeal was far from over. The tenacious beast pinned him down with its clawed paws and once again let out a thundering roar as if announcing its dominance. It then took a step back, an opportunity that Chase used to sit up. But this turned out to be a mistake, as the bear came at him again, this time round biting him on his leg and shaking him bitterly before throwing him up into the air. He came thudding down, but the bear was not done yet, as it went straight for his head. The picture of his beautiful wife Becca back at home waiting for him, and his brother high up on the ridge crossed before Chase, and he knew that he had met his fate on this mushy creek with a splatter of soft mud and snow. It was during this short flashback that his memory came to his aid, as he remembered an article that his grandmother had once shown him on how animals, especially bears, have sensitive bad gag reflexes on their soft palates. With great courage, he mastered the little strength left in him and with all his might shoved his right arm into the bear's throat. Perplexed and confused, the bear disappeared into the snow while gagging uncomfortably. Chase knew that it wouldn't take long before the bear came back to finish him off, or even worse, he would bleed to death. He had to move. His camouflage hunting gear had been torn to tatters and he was covered in blood and mud. With his palms, he wiped the blood off his eyes. He chose flight over flight and dawdled through the creek bed's terrain towards the direction of the ridge he had seen his brother take. From the ridge, Shane saw his brother waving and thought that the cavalry was finally here. He positioned himself with his bow and arrow, ready to take the shot of his life. However, after taking a second look at his younger sibling, this time with more of a degree of acuity, Shane realized the dire state of his brother. He immediately dashed down to him and administered first aid. He stopped the bleeding but was worried about the possibility of internal bleeding and had to rush Chase to the hospital. He hurriedly carried Chase to the car, gunned the engine, and pressed his foot hard on the gas pedal. The engine revved and the tires screeched as the rubber came to contact with the tarmac. Leaving a cloud of smoke behind, the air was filled with the smell of burnt diesel and rubber. Within seconds, the speed gauge was jerked a little over 100 miles per hour. The 20-minute drive felt like an eternity as Chase seemed to lose a decade with each breath. Luckily, there were only a few cars on the road, and within no time, they saw a big blue and white hospital sign. They were now at the emergency wing of the Benefice Teton Medical Center in Choteau. Fortunately, they arrived just in time to save his life. After a 5.5 hours long surgery, Chase's face was covered in hundreds of stitches. And when asked for his advice to anyone who wants to go hunting, he said that they should never go alone. And he is right. Don't go hunting alone in rainy, misty weather. Try as much as possible to live in agreement with nature. After all, if you respect it, it will always reward you. If you don't, you may end up meeting your final affliction.
It was September 4th, 2006. Another day at work for 44-year-old Steve Irwin as he loaded his truck with supplies and equipment and set off for the Bat Reef near Port Douglas in northeastern Australia. He and his crew were preparing to shoot underwater footage for an upcoming documentary called Ocean's Deadliest for the Discovery Channel, directed by John Stanton. For several days prior to the scheduled shoot, John couldn't shake an eerie feeling that something bad was about to happen. He talked to his friends and producer requesting to call off the documentary, but the channel had already spent too much money on the project and could not afford further delays. But John Stanton still had an uneasy sensation that something would go wrong. He drafted a will and reluctantly set off for the reef, accompanied by Steve Irwin and his cameraman Justin Lyons. On the morning of September 4th, after arriving at the small town near Port Douglas, they boarded Steve Irwin's 75-foot research boat called the Croc 1 and sailed to the Bat Reef, near the Great Barrier Reef on the eastern Australian coast. The area hosted various species of marine life, including sea turtles, dolphins, and whales, but the crew wanted to encounter a shark to film for this episode, and so they donned their suits and put on their snorkels for a dive into the water. The sea was muddier than usual, and Steve and his cameraman Justin could not find a safe spot to look for a wandering shark. They decided it was best to call off the shoot for the day, as it was not the right time. But before they left, Steve Irwin spotted something that piqued his interest. It was not a shark, but a beautiful stingray. These marine animals could grow up to 5 meters or 16 feet in length, including a long, piercing tail of which they had great control and agility. It was their primary weapon in the underwater ecosystem. But Steve Irwin was not irked by the creature. He had been doing this his entire life and knew that stingrays were not known to attack humans unless provoked or accidentally stomped on. Steve swam closer to the animal until it was right beneath him. He thought this was the perfect angle to film some shots for his daughter Bindi's upcoming wildlife children's show called Bindi the Jungle Girl. He signaled his cameraman to swim down to him and start filming the animal. It was a serene sight. In the backdrop of the colorful ocean floor, stingrays had seldom been observed in such close proximity, as they would usually swim off or bury themselves in the sand upon encounters with humans. As Justin Lyons swam closer to Steve Irwin, they were blissfully ignorant of what was about to happen next. Steve Irwin was now only a few feet above the stingray, trying to work out the best angle to get a shot. But as he hovered closer, the stingray suddenly lunged its long, sharp tail upwards, slicing through Steve Irwin's chest. He didn't immediately realize the magnitude of the attack, and a numbing sensation engulfed his body for a few seconds. In the commotion of the water before they tried to swim back up, Steve Irwin instructed Justin to keep the camera rolling. Even in such dire circumstance, he wanted to get something out of the encounter. Justin Lyon, however, was painfully aware of what had just happened. There was a large 2-inch hole in Steve's chest, and he was now bleeding profusely, turning the surrounding water red. Fearing that the blood could attract a nearby shark, Justin grabbed Steve Irwin and urged him to swim up to safety. When they resurfaced, the gravity of his injuries became immediately clear. Steve Irwin was now in excruciating pain and losing blood fast. He screamed to Justin that his lungs had been punctured by the brutal attack, but the reality was far worse. The stingray's tail had cut into the side of Steve's heart, and the massive blood loss meant that he could lose his life in a few short minutes. Justin Lyons screamed to the crew on the boat that Steve Irwin was badly injured and needed help fast. The colleagues frantically threw him on an inflatable speedboat and quickly tried to get him to land. All the while they were with Steve, he displayed an indomitable spirit. He was losing consciousness, and as Justin and the crew forced weight on the wound to stop the bleeding, they called on him to stay alive for the sake of his family and his 2 children. Steve Irwin realized these were indeed his final moments, and calmly said he was going to die as they administered CPR. A few minutes later, he stopped moving. His eyes closed and his face turned blue. Steve Irwin, famed wildlife conservationist and beloved TV presenter, was dead.
Got a beautiful white blaze on his chest. Oh. He thinks I'm gonna take the banana off him. I gave him the banana.
And what do you want to be when you grow up?
Just like my daddy.
Just like your daddy.
Australian crocodile hunter Steve Irwin has died during a diving expedition near Port Douglas in Australia.
He was a charismatic crocodile hunter who cheated death again and again.
Terry Irwin has spoken of the loss of the man she called the love of her life. In a statement read by Steve's dad, she thanked the thousands who offered their condolences, and she's decided his public memorial will be held where Steve felt most comfortable, the crocodile pen at Australia Zoo.
Paramedics were called on the shore for a faint chance of resuscitating him, but it only took them a few seconds to declare that Steve Irwin had succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Even if he had been taken to a hospital, there was little chance that he could survive a strike straight into his heart. The stingray's razor-sharp tail had cut through Steve's chest, and he died among the animals and wildlife he had loved and cherished his entire life. The entire ordeal, from the stab of the stingray's tail to the final moments that the paramedics were trying to revive Steve Irwin, were captured on Justin Lyons' camera. But in respect for Steve's fighting spirit and to save his family the pain of witnessing the scene of his death, Justin deleted the final copy of the tape after a brief police investigation. The footage was never seen or released, but the sight of Steve's horrifying and painful final moments remained forever ingrained in the memory of the crew on board and the colleagues that loved and cherished him. His wife and children were on a trip in Tasmania when they heard the news of Steve Irwin's demise, and they were devastated and inconsolable at the tragic loss of their husband and father. His wife Terry and his children Bindi and Rob immediately traveled to the Australia Zoo, which Steve Irwin had run, and were met with love and consolation from thousands of adoring fans outside. Steve Irwin had earlier remarked that he would consider his final purpose in life fulfilled if he could pass on the torch of nature conservation to his children. In keeping with their father's wish, Bindi and Rob became dedicated zookeepers and conservationists and worked to carry on Steve Irwin's legacy in honor of his tragic and untimely final affliction.